And for more on the leadership change and how it's likely to be viewed globally, I'm joined by Cole Bockenfeld, Advocacy Director for the Project Middle East Democracy. Cole, thanks for joining us. I want to get your sense first on the international reaction to the outcome of this election, and how are other countries likely to view this and their plans on working with Egypt in the future?
Well, I think for most international actors, including those in the U.S., the election results were really a foregone conclusion. I don't think the results are a surprise. What was a bit surprising was the low turnout figures and essentially the conduct of the elections, which cast some doubt on how widespread General Sisi's support really is, and if the process itself was one that was free, fair, and transparent.
So let's talk about this turnout. I mean, these elections have been coming for a long time. This date has been set. What's likely to happen for those people who did not take part in this election? Do you think that they'll participate in this government or how this country is shaped going forward?
Well, I think there was a very narrow base of support that really turned out for Sisi and his vision going forward. I think a lot of people in Egypt, and not just the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters who were formally excluded from the process, a lot of others, seem to think that the process was essentially predetermined, that there wasn't any point in participating, and that this government has its own plans with or without the support of the people. So I think it will be really interesting watching going forward exactly how this government tries to organize support behind its initiatives where it's clearly lacking and clearly came up a little bit short of where they expected.
We mentioned and you mentioned that this outcome was not a surprise at all. How do you see Sisi addressing their priorities? Adel said in his report that security is one of the main concerns. How soon do we see some change, real change, on the streets there?
Well, of course, the main message was that General Sisi would restore stability, that he would sort of get things back to normal, that he would deal with instability and terrorist threats with a firm hand. And I think from a military perspective, you'll continue to see a lot of those efforts, particularly in Sinai and so on. But what I do worry about is the sort of extension of that campaign to all of his political opponents. We've seen some indicators, quite a few indicators of that in the past few months, and I think with the sort of unease this government has and not getting the kind of support it expected, the response, instead of opening up and trying to be more inclusive, may be just the opposite, that they may go after their opponents even harder to intimidate and strike fear in anyone willing to challenge them.
Do you see continued instability in this country in the next few months, coming years? And how would you compare his leadership style to some of the other people that Egypt has seen? If for people just tuning in, how would you compare el-Sisi?
Sure. Well, I think the only path to real stability in Egypt are major economic reforms and a sort of open political process. I don't expect to see either under the leadership of General Sisi. I think just looking at the indicators of the last 6 months or so, the country is more unstable, more repressive. The economy is in worse shape, really, than any time in recent history, even worse than in the Mubarak era. And so I think unless there's sort of a dramatic reorientation and different kind of approach adopted, things will really spiral and get worse moving ahead.
So you think the country is actually moving backward and not forward?
Absolutely. I don't think that the kind of economic reforms that are needed to stabilize the country and address the demands that drove Egyptians to the streets are going to be addressed. And I don't think the sort of political trajectory is a positive one. I think in the short term, through a sort of strong-handed, heavy-handed approach, we'll see some stability restored on the surface, but I think that will be very temporary. And I think in the long term, some of the problems driving frustration among regular Egyptians will continue, and that will resurface.
All right, Cole Bockenfeld, we appreciate your perspective and your insight on this outcome.